On June 3, 2016, the world did not simply lose a former boxer, it lost a voice that had echoed far beyond the ring for more than half a century. When news broke that Muhammad Ali had died in Arizona at the age of 74, the reaction was instant and global. Television networks cut into regular programming. Athletes, presidents, actors, activists, and ordinary people all seemed to pause at once. Because Ali had not lived like a retired sports legend fading quietly into memory. Even in silence, even in illness, he had remained larger than life. His face, his words, his defiance, his humor, they had become part of modern history. So when that heartbeat stopped, the loss felt bigger than sport. It felt like the end of a certain kind of courage. The days that followed proved just how far his influence had reached. In Louisville, the city where he was born as Cassius Clay, crowds gathered not only to mourn, but to witness the farewell of a man who had become myth in his own lifetime. His funeral was not treated like a private goodbye. It was a global event, one that drew political leaders, religious figures, celebrities, former opponents, and thousands of ordinary mourners. The images were unforgettable. Flower-covered streets, crowds lining the route, a procession carrying the man who had once moved through the world with impossible speed and endless confidence. For a fighter who had spent his life forcing the world to look at him, the final farewell carried the same scale. Even death could not make Muhammad Ali small. But the size of that farewell raises the real question at the center of this story. How did a boy from segregated Louisville become a figure powerful enough to shake governments, redefine sport, and leave the world grieving him like a king? What transformed Cassius Clay, a loud and gifted young boxer, into Muhammad Ali, a man who was at once champion, rebel, symbol, and conscience? To understand why the world fell silent in June 2016, we have to go back to the beginning, before the cameras, before the titles, before the name Muhammad Ali meant anything at all. We have to go back to the boy who first learned how to fight and why he never stopped. Before the world knew him as Muhammad Ali, before the cameras, the microphones, and the impossible confidence, he was Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr., born in Louisville, Kentucky in 1942. He grew up in a segregated America where race shaped everything, where dignity had to be defended long before it could be celebrated. His father painted signs and billboards, his mother worked hard to hold the household together, and the city around him taught a brutal lesson early. Talent alone would not protect you from humiliation. Louisville was home, but it was also a map of invisible walls. In that world, young Cassius developed two traits that would define his life: pride and defiance. He hated being dismissed. He hated being looked down on. Even as a boy, he seemed determined to announce himself before the world could decide who he was. The story of how he found boxing has become part of American myth. At age 12, after his bicycle was stolen, Cassius angrily told a police officer he wanted to beat up the thief. The officer, Joe Martin, happened to train young boxers, and instead of giving the boy sympathy, he gave him direction. Learn to fight first. Cassius did. What followed was not just a hobby, but a transformation. In the gym, his energy found purpose. He trained with unusual hunger, driven not only by ambition, but by the thrill of proving himself. He learned quickly, moved lightly, and discovered that speed could be as dangerous as power. From the beginning, he was different. He talked more than other kids. He predicted victories. He wanted attention, but beneath the swagger was discipline. Boxing gave him a place where confidence was not arrogance if you could back it up. By his late teens, Cassius Clay was no longer just a local prospect. He was a serious young fighter with national promise. He won amateur titles, built a reputation for quick hands and endless self-belief, and eventually earned a place on the U.S. Olympic team. At the 1960 Rome Olympics, he won the gold medal in light heavyweight boxing. It should have been the perfect American triumph. A young black athlete representing his country on the world stage, returning home as a champion. But America was not ready to reward him with the equality that medals seemed to symbolize. That contradiction, celebrated abroad, diminished at home, cut deep, and it would matter later. Because by the time Cassius Clay returned from Rome, he was no longer just a gifted boxer. He was beginning to understand that the fight in front of him would never stay inside the ring. When Cassius Clay turned professional, he did not enter boxing like a respectful newcomer waiting his turn. He entered like a storm. He talked before he had fully arrived, predicted rounds before fights, and treated the press conference like part of the performance. To many older voices in boxing, it felt outrageous. Champions were supposed to prove themselves quietly, then speak later. Clay reversed the order. He spoke first, loudly, boldly, endlessly, and then backed it up in the ring. But what made him dangerous was not only his confidence. It was the fact that his style matched his mouth. Heavyweights were not supposed to move the way he moved. They were not supposed to glide, snap their jabs from impossible angles, and make bigger men swing at air. He looked less like a traditional heavyweight and more like a contradiction, fast as a lightweight, tall as a giant, loud as a preacher, and precise as a dancer. That contradiction exploded into history in 1964. Sonny Liston was supposed to destroy him. Liston was feared, intimidating, and heavily favored, the embodiment of heavyweight menace. Cassius Clay, by contrast, was young, flashy, and considered by many to be all talk. But when the fight came, Clay did not survive it. He controlled it. He frustrated Liston with movement, speed, and nerve, then shocked the world when Liston failed to come out for the 7th round. Suddenly, the impossible had happened. The loud young challenger had become heavyweight champion of the world. The image of Clay shouting, celebrating, and proving everyone wrong became one of the defining moments in sports history. Yet the shock was only beginning. Almost immediately, he announced his affiliation with the Nation of Islam and rejected the name Cassius Clay, calling it a slave name. Soon after, he became Muhammad Ali. That change was not cosmetic. It was a declaration. He was no longer asking the world to see him differently. He was telling the world it would. From that point on, Ali was no longer just a boxer winning fights. He was an event, a force, a provocation. Every appearance mattered. Every quote traveled. Every fight carried a meaning larger than the belt at stake. He fought Floyd Patterson, Ernie Terrell, and a list of contenders who were no longer facing only a champion. They were facing a man turning himself into a symbol in real time. His talent made him unavoidable. His voice made him unforgettable. The media could ridicule him, fear him, admire him, or misunderstand him, but it could not ignore him. That is when Cassius Clay fully disappeared into Muhammad Ali. Not simply the best heavyweight alive, but a new kind of global figure, one who turned sport into theater, identity into confrontation, and victory into a statement. And once a fighter becomes bigger than boxing, the next battle is never only about the ring. When Muhammad Ali returned to boxing, he did not return to the same world he had left. Years had been taken from him. Prime years, violent years, the years when a heavyweight's body is closest to perfection. But if exile had damaged his career, it had also sharpened his legend. He was no longer just a champion reclaiming a title. He was a man trying to reclaim time itself. The comeback carried urgency from the beginning. In 1971, he stepped into the ring with Joe Frazier in what was billed as the fight of the century. It was more than sport. Ali the exile, Ali the dissenter, Ali the fallen king, against an undefeated champion in his prime. Frazier won that night, handing Ali his first professional loss, but the defeat did not reduce him. It deepened the drama. For the first time, the world saw that even Muhammad Ali could be hurt, slowed, tested, and yet that vulnerability only made him more compelling. Then came the return to the top, not through comfort, but through punishment. Ali kept fighting, kept talking, kept rebuilding himself in real time. The rematch with Frazier, the wars of attrition, the rhythm of taking damage and still imposing will. This was no longer the young Cassius Clay floating untouched through the ring. This was an older, smarter, harder version of Ali, turning survival into craft. In 1974, he entered Zaire to face George Foreman, the most frightening heavyweight on earth. Foreman was younger, stronger, destructive in a way that made many believe Ali's time had finally run out. Instead, Ali created one of the greatest strategic performances in boxing history. The rumble in the jungle was not won by speed alone, but by calculation, nerve, and psychological control. He absorbed pressure, leaned into the ropes, let Foreman exhaust himself, and then struck. When Foreman fell, Ali had done more than regain the heavyweight title. He had remade himself again. But greatness always sends a bill. The later fights, especially the brutal third bout with Joe Frazier in Manila, carried a visible cost. The thriller in Manila was not just legendary, it was punishing, exhausting, nearly inhuman. Ali won, but victories like that leave residue. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the signs were becoming harder to ignore. His reflexes dulled. His body absorbed more than it once could. The public still saw triumph, still saw the smile, the showmanship, the icon returning to center stage. But underneath the mythology, the price of years in the ring was accumulating. Muhammad Ali had come back and conquered again. Yet every comeback asks a question: what did it take to make it possible? And in Ali's case, the answer was written not only in titles, but in the damage his body would carry for the rest of his life. By the time Muhammad Ali entered the final chapters of his life, the world was no longer watching him for knockouts. It was watching him for endurance. Parkinson's syndrome gradually slowed the body that had once seemed built from lightning. The hands that had danced in front of Sonny Liston, Joe Frazier, and George Foreman now trembled. His voice, once the loudest instrument in sports, became softer, harder to summon. And yet something extraordinary happened in that decline. Ali did not become smaller in the public imagination. He became larger. The man who had once conquered opponents with speed now moved through the world as a different kind of symbol. A reminder that dignity is not only found in triumph, but in the way a person carries suffering. He could no longer dominate a room the way he once did, but his presence still changed the air inside it. That is why the image from the 1996 Atlanta Olympics remains so powerful. When Muhammad Ali stood before the Olympic cauldron, his hands shaking visibly as he prepared to light the flame, the moment felt larger than ceremony. It was not just an athlete returning to the world stage, it was history confronting itself. The crowd understood immediately what they were seeing, not the loss of greatness, but its transformation. Ali had spent decades being loud, impossible, untouchable. Now the world loved him in silence. In his later years, he traveled, met world leaders, supported humanitarian causes, and remained one of the most recognized human beings on earth. By the time he died on June 3, 2016, from septic shock after respiratory complications, the sadness that followed was unlike the mourning reserved for ordinary sports legends. It felt global, almost presidential, and that is because Muhammad Ali had long since broken out of the category of athlete. He had become a measure of courage. He changed boxing, yes, but he also changed how fame could be used, how conviction could survive punishment, and how a black athlete could stand in front of power without lowering his head. He was champion, dissenter, performer, believer, target, and icon. Even in death, those identities did not cancel one another out. They fused into something bigger. Some men win titles, some men leave quotes. Ali left a standard. He proved that the greatest fight is not always the one under lights. Sometimes it is the fight to remain fully yourself while the whole world demands something easier.